everyone, and welcome to the Endless Summer Shirt Sew Along video. My name is Tilley. I'm a textile artist, clothing designer, and garment making instructor here in the southeastern United States. And I started a new home sewing pattern business with my original designs in 2023. And my newest pattern just came out, May 2024, the Endless Summer Shirt. Yes! I'm so excited to share this pattern with you. This is going to be part one of a two-part video series where I walk you through every single step that you need to make your own shirt. In this video, we'll go through looking at the sizing, picking out your fabric, and getting your garment cut out. In part two, I'll go through every step of actually sewing the garment. So let's dive in. My inspiration for this design was to have something that was very light and airy and extremely comfortable to wear in the dog days of summer while also still being stylish. This garment has not too many pattern pieces. You've got your front piece, your back piece, and then the yoke piece is actually all one piece that comes from the front to the back here. And at the base of the yoke, you've got significant pleating here and here, which is what's creating the majority of the shaping for this garment. You've got a center front seam, and then the shawl collar is part of this front panel and comes around and gets sewn to the back and finishes this edge in a lovely V-neck. The sleeve is all in one, so you don't have to set in a sleeve. Yay! And also, if you wanted to make any kind of adjustments here, it's going to be super easy because the sleeve and the side seam are all in one. It has a dramatic scoop front hem with a side seam split that's finished with a hem facing. And to be honest, I have not had a ton of experience with hem facings. It's been a lot more common for me to see neck facings. So if you're the same way, this might be a new way to learn how to hem a garment. You know, with such a curve as dramatic as this, you can't just do a double fold. So that's the point of that. It is a straight side seam, although you have all of this gathering here. So the straight side seam is nice if you're someone like me that likes to tuck things in. And then the idea is that the side seam is splitting kind of just above your hip bone so that you've got room for your hips. However, if you do want to make adjustments to give yourself more room in here, I go into detail in the booklet about how to do that. I'm calling this skill level a patient intermediate. Let me know if you think otherwise. It's a little daunting trying to decide what the skill level is. But I did intentionally use the word patient because there are some techniques in this that require some precision. And I know for me that if I come in knowing that I need to have patience for something, it makes it so much easier. So I just went ahead and put that in there just to kind of prepare you to be like, okay, we're gonna go a little slower and we're gonna do things a little bit more precise, but then we're gonna end up with really beautiful results. The pattern ranges from, I think we have a hawk nest in our woods, so they have been extra loud lately. The pattern ranges from This pattern comes in a double extra small to a 4XL, and I simply give you a bust range measurement, so the circumference of your bust to determine what size you want. You can see that the bust is a very generous fit here, right? See, both of us have a lot of looseness. The only way that I really feel like you need to pay attention to the sizing is really how this shoulder hits you. So I would say the only people that I would maybe say to disregard the bust measurement would be if you have a smaller size shoulder and a larger bust, then you might want to go down a size to accommodate this, because if this hangs over your shoulder, it's kind of obvious that the garment looks too big. And if you need a little bit more room here, it's much easier to add here rather than up here. There's finished garment measurements here, so that's the size of the garment itself, not your body. So that can kind of help you further determine. It has the shoulder length, it has the center front length, it has the sleeve length. And so you can look at those things if you want to try to make some changes before you start your garment. I'm a big fan of just making changes after I start the garment, but do whatever works best for you. Below that, I have fabric requirements in 2 different fabric widths. And pretty much, if you get 2.5 yards, you're gonna be golden for this garment. I do give you a separate measurement for the hem facing if you want to do a kind of separate hem color. If you don't, just go ahead and add that number onto the main body fabric requirement and you should be good. One thing I will keep in mind is that if you want to do a contrasting fabric here and your main fabric is slightly sheer, just make sure that you hold it up behind your main fabric and make sure that you like the way it looks. I know initially I was going to do a printed design for this, but I could see the printed design through the front and I decided that I didn't want that look. So just make sure that you're taking a look at that when you're making your decisions about fabric. I designed this garment to be made with a super lightweight or lightweight woven fabric. So a cotton lawn, a cotton gauze, a cotton voile would be great, although sometimes voiles can be very, very wrinkly, so you might want to think about that. Basically, if you go too thick, this is going to start being really bulky, all of this pleating. So just keep that in mind. And even a good technique is just to kind of pleat the fabric in your hand and just see how it feels. This is like a really standard run-of-the-mill quilter's cotton from Joann's. And I will say that if you choose something as standard as a quilter's cotton, it does kind of have a natural amount of body. Granted, if you have it tucked in, you're probably not going to worry about it, but this will kind of like sit away from the body a little bit more than something with a drape like a viscose or a crepe. Let me show you some of the samples I made for our photo shoot to give you some ideas of some fabric options. So this is a cotton lawn, and this was super crisp and easy to sew up. This is a crinkle gauze, much like the one that I'm wearing. And for me, I feel like this is just the floatiest, breeziest one to wear. I keep finding that this first prototype that I made, I just keep pulling it out and wearing it because it just feels like I'm wearing nothing. Crinkle gauze is a little bit fussier to work with than a cotton lawn because you do have that kind of stretch from the crinkle. So you might just need a little bit more patience with this, but I think it's totally doable. Here's one. This is another kind of lightweight cotton lawn. One thing to think about is you've got a center front seam here. So if you've got a pattern, you're going to want to pay attention to that. So for this window pane design, I kind of made sure that my window panes lined up perfectly there. And then I did my yoke on a bias so that I didn't have to worry about the window pane matching. Although bias is tricky, like this got a little fussy. I have to admit, I was not super excited about my results that I got. I did also make sure that my inner yoke, because you've got two yokes that kind of help finish this edge, I did make sure that that was cut on the straight grain so I had the benefit of the stability of the one inside. This is a fun one because this one is like a heavier weight. I don't know what this is. It's definitely got a viscose in it. And actually you can kind of see that, let's see, these are the same size. You can see it's got a heavier weight and it kind of stretched out over time because of the weight of that garment. Do you see that? So that's kind of an interesting thing to make note of. I think this might be like a silk noir, or maybe it has some linen in it. And so actually when I finished this one in the middle of summer last summer, I was kind of irritated because it didn't feel summery at all. But when fall came around, I really, really enjoyed this. So this is a good example of a heavier weight fabric, but as long as it had that drape, it still was flattering and it wasn't too difficult to sew all of these pleats. This is a sheer polyester chiffon, which this was a really big challenge to sew, but how gorgeous is that sheerness? I love the way that the pleats look in the sheer. I also played with adding side ties to this garment as a way of adding a little bit of shaping. Here's another quilter's cotton, and again, this did have like a thickness and a body to it, maybe bordering on a little bit too thick, but it's totally your preference. Here's a fun variety. So this was me simply cutting off the sleeve, which the debate's still out if I like the way that this fans. In a way, it kind of like covers up some things, but I don't know, everyone was kind of split on if they liked it or didn't like it. But this is a silk crepe, which if you've never sewn silk, I do think that silk crepe is easier to sew than you might think. And it's just a beautiful fabric to wear. Again, a wonderful drape. The sleeveless is extra great for summer. If you're more on the beginner side, I would really encourage you to shoot for a cotton lawn, but the world is your oyster and make your own choice. Other than the main fabric and your potential hem facing fabric, the only other thing you need is some interfacing. I will say that if you're using a super lightweight fabric, you might not want to use a fusible because sometimes that can kind of be wrinkly looking. And especially for something like this where you're working with something super sheer, I ended up using a piece of silk organza as the interfacing. And I think this might be the first time that I ever sewed in interfacing. So there's always a time to try something new. That takes care of our material requirements. So let's take a look at the paper pattern and getting that prepped for cutting out our garment. I wish I'd left one unfolded, but it's way too late for that. So here's the printed pattern that you would buy from me or from your local fabric shop. This is the front panel, and one thing that's obnoxious is I could not for the life of me get all these pieces onto one paper, so I had to cut the top of the shawl collar off and put it over here. So I instruct you, the very first thing you're gonna wanna do is cut this piece out and then tape it to the dotted line here. If you have the digital printout, you don't have to worry about that. Then you've got the back piece, you've got the yoke cut on the fold, you'll need 2 of those. And then you've got your hem facing piece, which works for both your front panel and your back panel. I made a point to do that because having 2 separate ones was very annoying to me. And then I did give you a piece for the interfacing, which I don't actually ever use the piece. I'll usually just measure it and then cut my interfacing to match that measurement. And then you've got your little size guide over here, and I'm a huge fan of the color coding that I started doing. That was actually my husband's idea, so apparently men do have ideas. Couple things to keep in mind is stuff does start to get a little convoluted in terms of these notches here, so the coloring definitely helps in that scenario. You will have 8 pleats on the front, so you'll have 16 notches here. Then you'll have 1 side notch, which on the bigger size here you can kind of see. And the notches are super crucial on this pattern because it's just gonna make it so much easier. It's gonna make it possible for you to sew. And so I do make a note that if you're someone that tends to not do it, I encourage you to do it for this one. Same with the front, you also have 8 pleats, so you'll have 16 notches, and then the arrows show which pleat matches the next pleat. Again, you have this little side shoulder notch, so make sure you get that, especially in the smaller sizes where it kind of seems hidden. I think in the next printing of this, I'm gonna add a little like arrow and be like, don't forget this. So now let's get to cutting out our fabric. I knew for this sample today that I wanted to pick a cotton gauze because I have loved this black shirt so much. So I went on to moodfabrics.com out of New York City. New York City! And I was amazed at how many gauze options they had, and I picked 3 fabrics, but then I couldn't decide which one I wanted to choose. So I posed it to my Instagram followers, and let's see what the final results ended up being. It was really close. So in first place with 33 votes, it's the Kelly green blocks. In second place was the pink and green ombre with 31 votes. And in third place was the mushrooms with 26. And actually, I'm kind of okay with that because I think the mushrooms might make a really fun summer dress. So, Kelly green blocks it is. And thank you for everyone who participated. I don't know why I love polls so much. They're just a lot of fun. So I've pre-washed this fabric and I let it air dry because I actually don't own a dryer. And with gauzes, I do kind of like to press the edges because the selvage tends to get a little crinkly. So I think I'm just gonna hit that with an iron really quick and then we'll get this laid out. With pretty much every garment that I cut out, I always start with folding the fabric in half, selvage to selvage. I won't necessarily always cut it that way, but I feel like this is a great way to start laying out a pattern. I've got my original pattern that I'm working with today on hard paper, and this is how I design all my patterns, is just on paper with pencil. You can see what a pain it was for me to try to figure out how to do all of this pleating. So you want to start with the back pattern piece first, setting that up on the center fold here. And then the garment is designed so that the curve of the hem matches the curve of the sleeve. And so this is part of why I created this shape, was so that I could make a really efficient use of the fabric. Granted, I didn't really make efficient use of the fabric with all of the other parts of the pattern, but you know, zero waste design is very difficult. One thing is, if you have a directional fabric or your fabric is too narrow, you're not going to be able to use this. In that case, you're going to end up putting the piece somewhere like this. If it's a super narrow fabric, you might end up being over here. I have found through all of the samples that I made, there's a variety of ways that you can cut this out to make things more efficient. So one thing I found is some pattern pieces get so wide with the front here, or your fabric so narrow that it goes right to the selvage. This center front seam will actually have about a 3/8 of an inch fold back here. So on some of these patterns, I've actually just lined this up with the selvage, and instead of doing that 3/8 of an inch fold back, I've just taken away 3/8 of an inch. In that case, I would use my quilter's ruler, lay it out along the selvage, and then line my pattern piece up at 3/8 of an inch. And then instead of folding back that piece when you get to that part in the pattern, you can just not fold it and leave the selvage. This can actually be a really nice detail, especially if you have a really beautiful selvage, and then it cuts down on the amount of work you have to do because you don't have to fold that back and you've just got a perfectly finished edge. Some garments I have found that I needed that full width, so utilizing that selvage was crucial. Another thing that I've done, which actually I think I did on the shirt that I'm wearing today, is this part of the sleeve kind of makes this less efficient to cut out. So one thing that you can do if you need the space is you can fold from the corner of where your yoke's going to be attached to this first notch, and actually you can see that I have a line here, and you can cut out this piece. Just make sure you add 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and then you can move this pattern piece and cut this out wherever you can get it. And then what that means is you just need to create a seam here and sew these two pieces together before you start. So that can be really nice if you have a limited amount of fabric and you're trying to make efficient use. You can do it on the front or the back or both. But if you want to be quick and zippy, just leave it on there. And to reiterate what I said earlier, you do have a center front seam here, so you might want to take extra precautions about what that piece looks like before you start cutting if you have something really obvious like a straight line. This pattern kind of has a broken straight line, but I still want the straight line to kind of match up. When I did that window pane, I definitely specifically cut it exactly parallel to the straight line and started there and then lined everything up to that. Okay, so I've got my front and back pieces laid out, and then when it comes to my yoke, I actually cut mine out so that it is full, or I can cut it on the fold. And I think the most efficient use of fabric for this might be to lay this open and cut my two pieces out right here. Or I could cut these pieces out and then fold this in half and use my pattern like this. So I believe that I bought 2 yards of fabric, and then this has been pre-washed. I haven't quite used 1.5 yards for the size large with a 55-inch wide fabric. Oh, but I've got my hem facing. I'll probably do just a matching hem facing because I think that'll be what's easiest. Ta-da! So this gets cut on the fold, so I will probably fold this again and get all 4 within this. So this took me 1.5 yards. Since this pattern does have some straight lines, I think I'm going to start by cutting out this line first, matching up the fabric, and then cutting everything else out from there. I'm getting a little fussy, but I'm also just eyeballing here. Now I can just line up this to itself and then adjust everything from there. I'm still getting the hang of paying attention to things like how a pattern lays when you cut out a garment and making sure that it looks balanced, or the placement of a design. That's definitely a skill that I keep working on improving. Two, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Also, when you go to cut out these notches, it might be helpful, especially if you have like a highly patterned fabric, to maybe keep this right next to you so you can really make sure that you're accurately cutting out these pieces. See how much work it took to get to figuring all this out. What a mess. And then make sure that you mark this notch here. This notch at the bottom is also important because that's going to be where your hem splits. You'll also want to mark center back at the top and the bottom. And I like to mark this by clipping just a little V, just like this. And what's nice about that is that it'll be different than the yoke notches, so that I'll be able to clearly see what is center back and what are yoke notches. And if you forget to do this now, you can do it later when you realize that it'll be helpful. So this is folded in half, and then I folded it in half again so that I can cut both yokes at the same time. And you've got one notch on the yoke that's marking the top of the shoulder seam. And I'm cutting out my facing in the same way I cut out the yoke, where I'm cutting out the front and the back facing on the fold and doing both of them at the same time. And there's one notch on the hem facing. For cutting out interfacing, I prefer to just measure what I need to cut. So 17 inches by 1 1/4. And then I set this to the side and I'll just use my ruler and rotary cutter to do a 17 inch by 1 1/4 inch strip. And this is just your run-of-the-mill Pellon fusible lightweight woven interfacing. Whatever you've got on hand will be good. And we're all set with our cutting. We've got our back panel cut on the fold, we've got 2 front panels, 2 yoke panels, and 2 hem facings, as well as my piece of interfacing. And what next? To start sewing. So stay tuned for part 2 where we go through every step of the sew along. If you are interested in purchasing this pattern, you can buy it directly from me on my website, AnnTilleyHandmade.com, in a digital PDF file or a paper pattern that I will send to your door. Or you might find it in a few select indie local fabric stores. If you feel like your local fabric store would be interested in carrying my patterns, make sure to let them know. Maybe it'll happen. Maybe it won't. I'm a one-woman business. I'm doing what I can, when I can. I appreciate your support and stay tuned for part 2. Bye.